Good afternoon. We start early, but the usual caveats apply. Thank you for coming here after lunch. Hopefully, you're not about to fall asleep. But if you are, I can give you a guarantee that Dr. Nag is going to have you up and awake in no time. So, like the last time I did, my job here is to recap what happened in lecture 1 and lecture 2. Easily done. Lecture 1, we thought about development, what it is, what it means, where it comes from, and how does it benefit you? What is the quality of development? What is the quality of economic growth? And why should you care about it? You are in your undergraduate, you're in your postgraduate, and sometimes one often does not think about economic growth when they are going through college. You're busy with other things. That is quite understandable. But the quality of growth, the quality of economic acceleration and deacceleration that is happening in a country directly impacts you as you go and as you grow up. So that was, in a nutshell, what lecture 1 was about. Of course, there were many, many other caveats, there were points and there were sub-points, which I'm not going to go into right now. The lecture 2 was essentially the passing away of Homo economicus, this agent that economists like myself had created over a long period of time. Sometime in early 1980s, passed away to be replaced by what we now call Homo rationalicus, right? So you got to hear from Dr. Nag about different models of how you make decisions, how these decisions may or may not have a direct impact on your ability to grow as a person. Also, what happens when you make quick decisions versus when you make decisions that you think about. So, with a lot of illustrations, Dr. Nag told you about System 1 and System 2 thinking. This is something for which Daniel Kahneman, who was a legendary behavioral economist who passed away unfortunately this year, but he lived a complete life and was awarded the Nobel Prize. And then Dr. Nag connected all of this and left it open by inviting all of us on a speculative tour of what it means to get the elements of economic development and economic growth and new models of looking at the psychological aspect of economics. And in the third lecture today, he's going to tie it all up and he's going to talk about how do you get to this point where, for people who are here, could go all the way to Denmark? So, go not by booking a ticket, but being there mentally, physically, and economically. Without further ado, Dr. Nag, over to you.
Mr. Vice Chancellor, Mr. Pro Vice Chancellor, where is Mr. CEO? He was here. Anyways, wanted to acknowledge his presence. Nishit, Dr. Khan, deans, directors, students. Amog has very quickly and well summarized my first two. So let's start with the third lecture. And the third lecture basically talks about the three institutions which broadly make up society. And that is the state, the government, as we know, the markets, and then us, the community. Now, for a long time, there was this feeling that governance is the responsibility of the government. Okay? So they're responsible for fighting corruption, they're responsible for ensuring justice, etc., etc. And we, the people, are essentially the beneficiaries or victims of the lack of governance. Over time, one realized that, of course, the state has a very important role to play. And I'm using the word state essentially in a broader context than government, but think of them as the same. But there are two other institutions which govern our day-to-day life, markets, and of course us. So I will talk about how these three institutions need to function to get good, strong institutions leading to good governance, which in turn leads to good development. Remember, the ultimate aim is good development, which is ultimately about freedom and all that. Means to get that, among other things, good governance is a necessary condition, not sufficient. And to get good governance, you need good institutions. And today, I'm going to talk about the interplay of the three institutions, the state, the markets, and the community, and make the point that, of course, these three institutions must work well. But the more important thing is how well do they work together. Think of them as fellow travelers. You need to get to Denmark. That's your North Star. So it's not a question of state gets there or the markets get there or the community gets there. It's a question of the three of them walking in tandem to get there. Each supporting each other, each helping each other along the way. So let me start with the state. Now, as I said in my very first lecture, a recurring theme that we always hear, and I mentioned the many field visits and my interviews with people all over the world, is the feeling of the poor, not so much of income poverty. They, of course, talk about being poor and income deficiency, income deficit, but the more overriding is what they always said that they're afraid of. They're afraid of the village landlord. They're afraid of the money lender. They're afraid of the knock on the door. They're afraid of the goons. So this fear is a major debilitating force because it arises from the inability of the society to ensure what Professor Sain has called the fundamental freedoms. And the fundamental freedoms are, and we discussed it in the first lecture also, freedom from violence. You want to be, even if you're poor, you want to be able to sleep at night, not be afraid of being attacked. You want to be free of injustice. And of course, you want to be free from want. You want to be free of want of income, illiteracy, hunger, illness, whatever. So these three freedoms are essentially what we expect from the state. Now, who is going to provide this? Now, writing in 1651, almost 400 years back, 380 years back, Thomas Hobbes, a British philosopher economist, who essentially had a very dim view of human nature. He said, ye log manne nahi wale hain type. So what you need is a very strong state, and he called this state Leviathan. Very powerful. That Leviathan will keep everybody on track. Everybody will be afraid that if you mess around, Leviathan will get you. So if you attack somebody, you will be punished. If you, take undue advantage of somebody, you will be punished. In one sense, that's great. So people would be then free to do their thing because they'll be free of this fear, the fear being taken care of by the Leviathan. Now, there comes a fundamental dilemma. What if the Leviathan goes rogue? Then you have basically replaced the fear of the many by the fear of that one. And that one, the Leviathan, becomes the despot. So the monarch or the king or the ruler, he runs amok. And you have no recourse because you have now vested all your power in that Leviathan. Huh? So that is where the balancing comes. Try to do too much, the state becomes despotic, runs the risk of becoming the fearful Hobbesian Leviathan. And try to do too little, of course, chaos reigns. That's what we were talking about. And everybody is free to do what they want. There's nobody to hold together. So the state needs to find a balance between its role as the guardian of justice and peace, but also somehow be constrained so as not to become the absolute despot itself. Okay? And that is what is called in literature that you need the shackled Leviathan. The Leviathan has to be shackled. And of course, we will see who is going to shackle the Leviathan. We all agree we need a powerful state, but we want also the state not to get so powerful as to become the problem itself. So the appropriate role and size of the state is, of course, a matter of great controversy on this spectrum, and also the resources available to the state, the competency of the state. So the state will have to prioritize. There's always this feeling in many, let the government do it. But the government can't do it. And I use the word government and state sort of interchangeably. It depends on resources they have. Therefore, it depends on the taxes you pay. So in terms of priority, obviously, the principal role of the state would be to equitably and efficiently, both are important, fairly and efficiently, manage the collective public goods. And you just imagine the most important public good is law and order, because you and I can't ensure public order. The state will have to have the absolute monopoly over violence. The only organization which can use violence must be the state. If you and I resort to violence, it obviously is going to break down. But the state's use of the violence also has to be constrained. Otherwise, they can let loose the police and the army on civilians, and that will be the end of it. So, to protect the weak and the marginalized and the poor and everybody else in society, you need the state to be that guardian of peace and security, and therefore laws which are written, more importantly laws which are implemented, would have to be a function of the state. Keeping people safe, keeping people healthy, keeping people educated. Not in every sense of the word. You can't have the state doing everything. But the state must take fundamental responsibility for basic education, basic health, basic sanitation, basic water. And of course, I'll bring in the market. But the point is that the state must be able to address market failures, and we'll come to talk about it, and all of you know about market failures. We don't have perfect markets. So state essentially must be able to provide the ecosystem for the markets to operate in and communities to thrive in. And how does the state do that? It does it by not doing it itself, but by providing the right framework. It doesn't have to become the producer and supplier of goods, but it has to provide the right rules and regulations and arbitration and contract enforcement for the private sector. It must ensure property rights. I will not invest if I'm not sure if my land may not be expropriated or may be expropriated. So the state's role in that sense is essentially not to do, at least not as the first resort, but as a last resort, but do things of public good. National defense is obviously one example. You don't want private armies, but you don't want the state to also come and sort of guard your house, for example. So the state essentially provides the larger framework, of which the most fundamental is to protect people from this fear, and the corollary is to ensure that they feel a sense of freedom, of those three fundamental freedoms. Okay, let's go to markets. So that's one of the traveler, the markets. Now, I will not get into a discussion about do markets matter, do we need markets. We're not talking about, we've gone past the discussion on the role of markets. But what we cannot ignore is that markets are not perfect. Market failures exist. That is why handling issues like pollution or collective goods cannot operate in a market sense. And therefore, the state's role is to be address market failures. And when the state provides adequate and credible, important is credible, assurances of respect for property rights and protection against arbitrary actions, which means, look, if you invest, you can, make money, your money will be taxed at X%. That's the assurance. But also it has to be credible that I won't change my mind tomorrow. I won't say tax rate is 20 and then tomorrow I'll make it 25. Then, under those set of credible and enforceable ecosystem, the markets will then find their own sets of equilibrium. Okay? And then markets on their own then, within this ecosystem, subject to the laws and regulations, they will generate economic growth, they will generate the opportunities, they will do the necessary in pursuit of their own goals of profit maximization. They will also then create the ecosystem for increased affluence. Okay, so I just want to, some of you might start to think about, do we not have to justify markets? I'm taking that as given that markets matter. What I'm saying is the state has to address market failures, which are just as important. Way back in 1776, Adam Smith, you would all know, wrote this famous Wealth of Nations. And his basic insight, brilliant insight, was if the baker bakes his bread and the butcher produces the meat and the tailor sews the clothes and the farmer does the farming, as if guided by an invisible hand, each will get to their optimal. The butcher will do the best he can, the baker will do the best he can. But surprisingly, this invisible hand leads us to a situation of all of us doing well also. That was the brilliant insight, that individuals pursuing their self-interest would lead the society to also lead to its optimal equilibrium. Now, what Adam Smith, he wrote about it but didn't get that much attention, is that assumes something called perfect competition. Okay, but we all know perfect competition usually doesn't exist. There's always the risk of monopolies and cartels. And as a matter of fact, Adam Smith, though he wrote this book, The Wealth of Nations, he also wrote pieces in which he said, can't trust the business people. If they ever get together, they'll only talk about prices and forming cartels. Okay, so he had a skepticism, but nevertheless, that role has to be performed by the state. So just as I said, the state has to be shackled, the behemoth of the market has to be tamed. Okay, so that is where that balancing act. It's not as if the markets sort of can do what they want, and will all assume it's for the best, because it isn't. And the answer to that is not going to be to manage the market, the state grows. And the answer to a bigger state can't be bigger markets, and bigger markets, bigger state. You need something else to balance it. And that something else is the third traveler, the community. Okay? And I'll come to that in a moment. Okay, so the community is us, right? It's the society, it's the neighborhood, and community, in a sense, is at the heart of development. We are talking about good development for whom? Not for the state, not for the markets. We're talking about good development for us, particularly the poor and the marginalized and those who are sort of at the bottom of the pyramid. So ultimately, the journey to Denmark is going to be judged, a successful journey is going to be judged, not if the state has got there or markets have gone there, but if the community, along with the others, reach it. Now, it is, again, going back to a fundamental point. For a long time, there was a belief of the Sarkar as my baap. The Sarkar believed it because it suited them, but more importantly, we believed it. We said, that's good, I'll go and do my bit and somebody will take care of it. So getting a community involved in taking charge is not easy, okay? And for its part, as I just said, the state also has not made it very easy for the community to be involved in. The state has, more often than not, taken the community as being passive beneficiaries of goodies they give from the top. Okay, I'm going to give you a SOP, you should be grateful. I'm going to open a school, grateful. I'm going to do this, it's good for you. But we have to think of a paradigm in which the people, the community, are not just beneficiaries of development, but a participant in development. So they have to have a say, but they also have to have a contribution. So it's not that we, the people, will just sort of say, I want A, B, C, D, E. Yes, we should and we must, but then we have to sort of see how we will contribute to it. And that is a challenge. And the reason it's a challenge is also because of the power asymmetry in society, which I mentioned. I might say I want to do this, but who am I? Just one person on the side. The state is always more powerful. And the state, in turn, being influenced by the people at the top, the rich, the powerful, maintain the status quo. It's in their interest to maintain the status quo. So my basic thesis is that this asymmetry is in the interest of the powerful to maintain. The landlords, there is no reason for them to suddenly one morning say, wake up and say, I'm going to be generous. But we have to have a process by which, as I mentioned the case of the Glorious Revolution and other revolutions throughout, when they, the powerful, agree to share power, not because they've suddenly become magnanimous, but because they realize that the alternative is worse. And as in the King Charles I in England, he paid for it with his head. Okay? So obviously, we're not talking about getting there, but that is the dilemma, and that is the challenge of this balance. And as I said last lecture, I believe that the community's involvement will depend on the community's human agency. And that is where the education and health becomes very, very important. And if you do that, that's a necessary condition. But then let me give you some examples of how these things actually work. I mean, as I keep saying, I often make a very clean, very sort of in a broad sweep, but these are all something that has happened and is happening, and these are sort of, well articulated. The city of Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark. If you go there, it's a beautiful city, lovely quality of life, lovely restaurants, people are biking, they all look healthy, etc. But in the mid-1980s, the city was going through a major crisis. And the major crisis was they'd run out of money. They were running deficits of close to $750 million a year because the government policies of subsidizing move to the suburbs of Copenhagen meant the city core was getting hollowed out. People were buying homes outside. And the jobs were getting lost because of the effect of globalization. Many of the jobs were being lost to China and many other places. So a combination of moving out of people to the suburbs and loss of job meant that Copenhagen essentially was either inhabited by students who were studying or the relatively poor, neither of who were very major taxpayers. Okay? So this Kingdom of Denmark sort of did, I think, a brilliant thing. They basically said, let's get into what is called inclusive localism, which basically means get the community involved. The traveler called the state realized it was beyond them to solve the problem. So they involved the third traveler and the second traveler. So what they did was they said, okay, what's the asset we have in Copenhagen, in this core? Property. Wonderful property, which is sort of going to rot. They created a public-private partnership, a corporate entity, which had partnerships with commercial developers. The community was very involved in getting commercial, beautiful commercial spaces built. And people were starting to move back because it was attractive to live in, the infrastructure was good, and the result, as I mentioned to you, that Copenhagen today is a bustling city as a capital as well, of Denmark. So that's not one. Indianapolis in US, they, like many others, suffered the effect of deindustrialization in the States because of globalization. You remember the Rust Belt. Pittsburgh had the same problem. That was the steel belt, and suddenly steel was much cheaper to bring from China, so the steel factories started closing down. So what Indianapolis did was say, look, what can we do which cannot be sort of, shifted away? Basketball. You've got to play basketball in situ. You can't sort of, play it somewhere else. And basketball was something very popular there. So they built a beautiful stadium. Once they built that stadium, they invited the various basketball franchises. And the rejuvenation started. And the thought of basketball came because community was involved. They knew what was good. And they, of course, also got into biotech. Pittsburgh did the same thing. They lost their steel jobs. They started to get into biotech and autonomous vehicles and all of that, research. And actually then, in about 20 years or so, Pittsburgh started to be called Roboburg. Okay, robotics. So the point is, once you get the community involved as a participant, not just a beneficiary, that is where you'll start to see growth. Because the people sometimes, not sometimes, most of the times, know best what works there. But this, I should emphasize, is not an argument against federal or the provincial governments. people think of all of this as a zero-sum game. Giving power to the community means somebody less. No. This is what I have called, others have called, what is called the subsidiarity principle. Let the decision making get to the level where it is most effective. And I'm very pleased, Mr. Vice Chancellor, to see that in university you certainly practice subsidiarity very well. Students are very involved in many things, as CEO was telling me. And that's great. That is, rather than only the teachers and the director saying, do this. Of course they do, they have to. But the students are very involved. The subsidiarity principle is, I think, a very important part of this empowerment. Closer to home, a good friend of mine, unfortunately, he has passed on, came back from the World Bank, George Samuel, and he lived in Bangalore, and he found that the situation in his locality, social services, the infrastructure services, public service, was terrible. And so when he went to talk to the local councillor or the board chairman, they said, who the hell are you? You've come from Washington, go back to Washington, type of a thing. So what he did was, he said, look, I will not say this is bad, this is good, this is indifferent, you are doing a lousy job, because then people will get defensive. He formed the so-called PSC, Public Action Center, in which he just sent out a questionnaire to all his neighbors, saying on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you think is our garbage collection? On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you think is our street cleaning, etc., etc.? And people sort of, whatever number. But that by itself wouldn't mean much, and nobody would care. But what he did brilliantly was, he circulated the same questionnaires in a large part of Bangalore. So he had community A saying 5 on 10, community C saying something else, community A saying 8 on 10. He compiled it, and he went to see the chairman of BMDA, Bangalore Metropolitan Development Authority. First time he went, the chairman said, who are you? And second time, third time, he said, I just have to give you a scorecard. I said, scorecard? What scorecard is this? So this is the scorecard of your boroughs in Bangalore. But interestingly, after he left, he found out the BMDA chair called the borough chairs, and he said, what the hell is happening? Why is your score 5 out of 10 and theirs is 7 out of 10? And that started a whole process of rejuvenation. Now, Bangalore is far from perfect. Nobody is perfect. But it started a process of community involvement in a non-threatening way. He didn't say, you guys are inefficient, you guys are corrupt. He just said, this is what your clients feel about you. And this is what clients there feel about them. So what is the difference between these two? The budget is the same. Sometimes actually you're getting more money, so obviously some leakage is happening, etc., etc. My point is that community involvement is not a threat to the state. Depends on, of course, how it's presented. The three fellow travelers have to move in tandem to make sure it works. And how does it work? If the state gets too big, i.e. the despot, the community, not individually but collectively, can have a voice. And the markets can have a very important voice. Markets can leave. When I say markets, the investments. So you can do all you want. You change my tax rates retroactively, because that's what you think you can do. Okay, I'll leave. And as a matter of fact, that has happened in many countries. If I leave and I am company A or industry A, sure enough, industry B and industry C will say, what are we doing here? More importantly, industry D and E who were thinking of coming in will not come. And there's a whole series of literature on this so-called exit and loyalty. A very famous economist, Hirschman, and others have written on it. And that is a major control of the markets. Now, I know that I'm obviously being a bit naive and optimistic because the markets can also have a collusion role with the state. Huh? You get favors from the government to make sure you contribute enough to the political parties. That happens. But as you know, I always take the broader view and sort of think of the positives, and so that's one way. The community can have a very major, and people vote with their feet. If you have a large emigration, you've got to start at the state thinking why. Nobody wants to leave home for the sake of it. There is a reason. They're either fleeing persecution, they're fleeing economic persecution, deprivation, etc. So anyways, to conclude, if the state becomes too powerful, the Leviathan turns despotic. If the state is too weak, the society is chaotic. Situation in Somalia at the moment. In Somalia, there are so many warlords that nobody knows who is in charge. Bottom line is nobody is in charge. Society is chaotic. If the market is too strong, the society becomes inequitable because the cartels decide, the monopolies come in, they can price what they want. And if the markets become too weak, society becomes unproductive because the markets basically do not produce, do not employ, do not create the wealth. And of course, if the community becomes too strong, then the social order is disrupted because then some groups of people sort of can dictate what's going to happen. And if it's too weak, obviously it means that there's a possibility of not only inequity, but crony capitalism. Community being weak means markets and the state can sort of get together and say, you take this contract, you take this contract, and my friends will win. So the challenge is not only how these individual travelers will perform, but how the three of them will perform together. As I said, the three travelers traveling in tandem. Now, of course, you would say that this is all very well, Professor, but in institutional development, but isn't there something called leadership? And I want to come to that briefly because obviously it does. In 1965, Singapore was booted out of Malaysia. They were part of the Malay Republic. The Malaysians said, you guys are useless. You neither have water nor natural resources, get out. And Lee Kuan Yew was the leader. And he actually broke into tears. He said, my God, what am I going to do with my people? Literally no water, no resources, nothing. At the same time, 1965, another country in the East, Far East, Philippines, elected its 10th president, Ferdinand Marcos. At that time, Philippines was considered to be the jewel of Asia just after Japan. Japan had just held its Olympics in 1964, so Japan had already started to emerge as the obvious leader, and Philippines was the next. And if I tell you an anecdote, you'll be very surprised. There was the first escalator that was built in Singapore, first escalator in a shopping mall around that time, broke down. So big chaos, big confusion. So they said, now what do we do? They said, well, it'll take a long time to get a spare part. And the supplier said, no, we'll get it tomorrow. So what do you mean get it tomorrow? Where will we get it from? It's going to come from the US, right? They said, no, we'll get it from the Philippines. So Philippines had that role, that space in Asia. Fast forward 30 years, 25 years, both Lee Kuan Yew and Marcos were finishing their term. Marcos was running away, being airlifted out of Manila to Guam in a helicopter because there had been the so-called People's Revolution. Lee Kuan Yew was feted as the greatest leader Singapore has ever had. And Singapore, of course, in the meanwhile, as you know, became Singapore, and Philippines, became Philippines. So yes, leadership matters, no question. Crisis is the best time to test out leaders, and sometimes you're lucky. India had a major crisis in 91, balance of payments crisis. Our gold reserves were so down, our reserves were so down that we had to airlift our gold to England. And we had the leaders of Manmohan Singh and Narasimha Rao. They rose to the occasion, liberalization, everything that happened. Russia, after the breakdown of Soviet Union, again total chaos. In comes somebody called Vladimir Putin. He rationalizes the tax regime. He solidifies stabilizes the fiscal situation of the government, and Russia starts to move up. South Korea had a leader at the time, Kim Dae-jung. South Korea was just coming out of the Asian financial crisis where it had been completely decimated. Not completely, almost decimated. Now, these three people, in their own way, saved the day. Putin stabilized the Russian economy. Kim Dae-jung confronted the unholy alliance of the chaebols and the state banks. And the chaebols are conglomerates, basically had run up unsustainable debt because the state banks, the two pillars were in cohorts, the state and the markets. But he sort of, corrected it. And of course, the biggest reformer of all, Deng Xiaoping in China. Okay? So from these, you would say, well, leadership is important. You need to find that leader. I will give you a slightly different view because I want to continue this story. These leaders, all of them, great story, great achievements, made a difference, but leaders turn stale. And the reason leaders turn stale is like human beings, after a while, they start getting the taste of office. And they say, well, I think I should stay here longer. I should be here for, whatever period of time, and turn autocratic. And of course, then there are many people who say, oh, autocratic leaders are good for development, particularly for developing countries. You need discipline, you need law and order. Understandable. I mean, when you see chaos on the street, you think, somebody should wield the danda. And, it's appealing. But again, let's go by evidence. I mean, that's sort of always the best. There was a study done, 133 countries over the period 1985 to 2010. So you can't say the sample was small, 133 countries all over the world. And you can't say the period was small, this 1985 to 2010, that's a fairly long period. And the conclusion of the study were fascinating. And I'll just read it out. Autocratic leaders with positive effects on the economy, because there are some, occur only as frequently as one would expect due to chance alone. So totally random. I mean, you get, if you throw a dart, you probably get the same results. But this conclusion is not as damaging as the next one. However, the history of the autocratic leaderships with negative effects frequently exceed, which is not only is an autocratic leader not good for economic growth in the long run, but his, and I say his because most of the time autocratic leaders are actually universally are male, his rule is bad for the economy. Okay? So yes, you certainly see a blip. Think of Suharto, think of Erdogan, think of Putin. You see a blip. Then, so again, I have no emotions must be out of these discussions. Autocracy is good because, we are poor, autocracy, dictatorship is good. And I said, look, let's leave labels aside. let's look at the facts, let's look at evidence and see what it says. Evidence shows that autocratic leadership is not good. Okay? So, you have to think of leadership, I think, through a wider lens. Yes, it would be great if we can get a Mandela or a Gandhi or a King Arthur of Camelot. But I think we should start looking for leaders not just in that one pillar. Whenever we think of leaders, we think of the state. But there are leaders in the markets, in the second pillar. There are community leaders, and sometimes community leaders can sort of do wonders that we miss out. Think of people in the space of who have got Nobel Peace Prize. Some people in the state have got it, and deservedly so. But think of all the people who get the Nobel Peace Prize from the third pillar. Okay, so let me leave leadership out. My point is leadership matters, yes, but don't focus on a leader or the leader. Usually a leader or the leader does not lead to perfect solutions. Think of leaders in a broad spectrum in the three pillars. Okay, I will very quickly now go look into the future because, as I've said, my lectures are really not intended for us so much as them. My colleague and I looked at 10 global megatrends, and we published a book last year on Envisioning 2060. That was a book about the world, not just India or any other. So in that book, we identified 10 global megatrends. I'll very quickly go through them because they're a very important consequence for our lecture. Number one, the widespread growth of education, particularly girls. That's one global megatrend which is in that direction. Explosion in the size of the middle class and upper income groups. This is world over. I mean, this is a very macro sweep, but generally true. Increased urbanization. The world is getting more urban. Look at India. India is sort of still majority rural, but our urbanization rate is very high. China became urban, that is more than 50% were urban as far back as in 2013. So from a country which was very agrarian, urban, rising inequalities. And to me, that is going to be a very major challenge for all of us, certainly for our country. Climate change, accelerating pace of technical progress, technological progress, including AI. Part of that will be the ICT revolution. Emerging power of civic society. The third pillar is third pillar, the community. 20 years back when we talked about the third pillar, people said, oh, yeah, there's community groups, NGOs, we should just be good to them. When they come, chai pila do, baat karo, and then, we'll do our thing. They are now a power unto themselves, and I think the emergence of civil society is going to be a major factor. Accelerating spread of social media. It'll have its negatives, but I think the larger part is going to be positive. Rise of the emerging economies. India, growing country. It'll have a greater say in global governance than taking the post-Second World War governance structure. And, as I said, the demographics, the youth, not worldwide, because worldwide the population will stabilize, but various countries, India particularly, still has a huge demographic potential dividend. And the reason I say potential is because a large number of youth, hugely motivated, but these youngsters will have to have a meaningful role in life, including employment opportunities. If you don't, then this demographic dividend can easily turn into a demographic nightmare. And my greatest concern in our milieu, in our social milieu in India, is I think we are somehow assuming all these trends away when we don't like the sound of it. And therefore, I think the challenge of rising inequality, the challenge of the demographics, positive, potentially, negative, will be disastrous. Now, if these, I believe that these global megatrends will result in demand for good governance. The youngsters, and I'm sure I speak for all of you, won't tolerate corruption as readily maybe my generation did. We sort of somehow said, this is grease money, and I told you about how that is not grease money and how it's not acceptable. But the youngsters are going to be much less accepting of it. They'll be much more forceful. Urban population are going to be much more forceful about good governance than poor in the village, people in the village. People in the village are cowed down by the rural social structures. They are afraid of the sarpanch. People who live in an apartment block couldn't care less if a neighbor was, a senior officer, whoever. He wants the water supply that he has been assured of. And of course, the young, particularly the educated girls, are not going to tolerate many of the gender deprivations which have just been there and somehow people thought will become accepted. Caste discrimination, other discriminations. I think the young are going to be much more demanding, but also they will be part of the supply. It's not good enough just to demand, but I think a human capital that the youngsters will acquire would obviously be a positive factor. Now, overall, over the last 50, 70 years, the situation of governance in the world has improved. We have to be positive. The world today, as I said right at the beginning, is richer today. People live longer, they're healthier, they're more literate, and they enjoy better governance. Of course, we've got huge pockets of deprivations, including on justice, including on governance. But if you take a broad swath, there is reason to believe that the arc of history does bend towards Denmark. You just look at the situation in the US. When you look at what's happening now, you say, well, that country is gone. But just look at in the 1960s, the African Americans could not vote. You could not drink from the same fountain. This is in the US, not in Africa, not in South Africa. And look at the fact that we did have, or they had, an African American president in 2008. So, where do I come out of all of this? My feeling is that overall, the pressures for good governance are only going to increase. But I also think the capacity to deliver good governance of the three pillars will increase. And the three will walk better in tandem. Each country, I have to emphasize before I close, that each country will have to find its own way. Each country will not have the same Denmark. So India, China, they'll have a different Denmark. There is no one blueprint. There is no silver bullet. But as I said, the history of the world tells us that the journey does bend towards Denmark, and I see no reason why that path will not continue. So, Mr. Vice Chancellor, as I end this 3-series lecture, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much, and the faculty and the institution and the students for giving me this opportunity. This has been a great opportunity for me. And I really end this with a hope that each country, and certainly each one of you, will, paraphrasing Tagore, awake into that heaven of freedom